The evolution of Japan's reputation, from feudal warrior culture to World War II. Japan is often associated with anime, sushi, and sumo wrestling. When outsiders think of the country today, they may picture Godzilla, impeccable politeness, and cutting-edge technology. However, in the last century, Japan had a far darker reputation. What led to this infamous legacy of brutality during World War II? The roots of this reputation stretch back centuries, deeply embedded in the warrior culture of Japan. For much of its history, the country was divided into feudal states that were in near constant warfare. This period of intense conflict reached its peak during the Sengoku Jidai era, beginning in the mid-15th century and lasting until 1603, when the Tokugawa shogunate was established. Given the relentless warfare of this time, great cultural importance was placed on the samurai Japan's warrior class. During the subsequent peace under the Tokugawa rule, this warrior ethos was formalized into a strict moral code known as Bushido, meaning the way of the warrior. While its principles evolved over time, core tenets such as self-sacrifice, reckless bravery in battle, and absolute loyalty to one's lord remained unchanged. The samurai era eventually came to an end with the Meiji Restoration in 1868, as Japan abolished its rigid social structure and embarked on rapid industrialization after centuries of isolation. Even though the samurai class disappeared, Bushido was repurposed for the modern age. Instead of loyalty to a feudal lord, devotion was now directed toward Emperor Hirohito and Japan's military leadership. These ideals played a significant role in shaping the country's actions before and during World War II. As Japan modernized, its military and educational institutions fully embraced the strict discipline of Bushido. Schools instilled obedience to authority as the highest virtue, using harsh methods to enforce it. Students endured severe physical punishment, including beatings, forced endurance exercises, and relentless drills. This type of indoctrination produced a generation of soldiers who displayed unwavering loyalty and obedience, refusing to retreat or surrender under any circumstances. One of the most notorious aspects of Japanese military culture during World War II was its determination to fight to the bitter end. Surrender was seen as an unthinkable disgrace, a permanent stain on a soldier's honor. While other armies might surrender when further resistance became futile, Japanese forces continued fighting regardless of casualties. For comparison, while 1 out of every 3 Allied soldiers captured in the war had been killed in combat, Japanese troops suffered an astonishing 120 deaths for every 1 soldier taken prisoner. Rather than surrender, they often launched suicidal Banzai charges, rushing headlong into enemy lines in a final desperate assault. The name derives from their battle cry, Tenno Haika Banzai, which roughly translates to "Long live the Emperor." One of the most infamous Banzai charges took place on July 6, 1944, during the Battle of Saipan. After 3 weeks of intense fighting, American forces had gained control of much of the island and were closing in on the remaining Japanese defenders. Instead of surrendering, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, the commanding officer, committed seppuku, ritual suicide, rather than face capture, adhering to samurai tradition. Inspired by his example, thousands of soldiers and even civilians launched a final frenzied attack on the American lines, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat for over 12 hours. An estimated 4,300 Japanese soldiers died in this assault rather than surrender, making it the largest Banzai charge of the war. hundreds of civilians also took their own lives, throwing themselves off cliffs rather than be captured by the Americans. This pattern repeated itself throughout the Pacific Campaign. Many Japanese soldiers feigned surrender, only to detonate hidden grenades or open fire on approaching Allied troops. After numerous incidents like these, American forces became deeply suspicious of Japanese soldiers attempting to surrender, often choosing to shoot rather than risk being deceived. The most extreme example of Japan's refusal to surrender was the Kamikaze attacks, suicide missions carried out by pilots who deliberately crashed their aircraft into enemy ships. These desperate attacks were an attempt to halt the relentless Allied advance toward the Japanese homeland. Kamikaze strikes peaked during the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, with waves of pilots targeting the American fleet. Over 5,000 US Navy personnel lost their lives in these attacks, marking the largest single battle loss for the US Navy in the war. Despite Japan's imminent defeat, the nation refused to yield. Plans were even made to arm civilians, including school children, with bamboo spears to resist an Allied invasion. The projected cost of such an invasion, known as Operation Downfall, was so high that US military planners estimated up to 1 million Allied casualties. In preparation, the US produced an extraordinary number of Purple Heart medals, so many that some of those original medals are still being awarded today. The refusal to surrender also shaped Japan's treatment of prisoners of war. Since surrender was seen as dishonorable in Japanese culture, enemy soldiers who laid down their weapons were regarded with contempt. Japan had signed, but never ratified, the Geneva Convention, which established humane treatment for prisoners of war. Many Japanese officers dismissed it as the coward's code and saw no obligation to follow its principles. When large numbers of Allied troops, such as the 80,000 British, Indian, Malaysian and Australian soldiers who surrendered in Singapore in 1942, were taken captive, Japanese forces were baffled by what they perceived as weakness. Prisoners of war were treated with extreme cruelty, often subjected to forced labour under horrific conditions. They were systematically starved, beaten, and executed for the slightest infractions. Some were used for bayonet practice, while others were decapitated by officers as a form of training. The death rate among Allied prisoners in Japanese camps was shockingly high. While the mortality rate for Allied soldiers held in German POW camps was around 1.2%, the death rate for those captured by the Japanese reached a staggering 37%. This blatant disregard for human life extended beyond enemy soldiers to civilian populations as well. The Japanese held deeply xenophobic views, particularly toward the Chinese. As early as 1931, Japan began expanding into Chinese territory, culminating in the full-scale invasion of China in 1937. That December, Japanese forces captured the city of Nanjing, committing one of the most infamous atrocities of the war. Over the following 2 months, an estimated 100,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians were massacred, with widespread acts of torture and sexual violence. In one particularly horrifying incident, 2 Japanese officers engaged in a competition to see who could behead 100 people the fastest, ultimately killing 106 and 105 victims, respectively. Perhaps the most disturbing example of Japan's wartime brutality was the infamous Unit 731. Officially known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, this covert research unit conducted horrifying human experiments, primarily on Chinese and Korean prisoners. Victims were deliberately infected with deadly diseases so researchers could study their progression. Others had limbs amputated or organs removed without anesthesia to observe how long they could survive. Various weapons, including firearms, explosives and flamethrowers, were tested on live subjects. These atrocities were carried out with the full knowledge and support of Japan's military leadership. Following the war, Japan distanced itself as much as possible from its militaristic past. The nation adopted a pacifist constitution, renouncing war as a means of settling disputes. Modern Japanese culture has since undergone a dramatic transformation, shifting its focus to technological innovation and global cooperation. This represents a stark contrast to the aggressive, isolationist and militaristic mindset that once defined the country during the early 20th century.